When Dr. Jones asked me to speak to you, or asked if I was interested, I asked for some guidance about what I should speak on, and he told me that I should mention place somewhere along the way, and that I should warn you against bad or inferior ways of doing history. Apart from that, I seem to be able to do anything. So, allowed to do anything, I thought I would begin this way. So, I want to tell you a story. In the spring of 2020, almost exactly 3 years ago, as we meet today, my grandmother died here in Pierre. She lived a rich, full life, not slipping away until she was 107 years old. And with her passing, only my aunt remains, tying me to Pierre in life. Now, I mention my grandmother simply because she told me something a few years earlier about a women's organization called PEO. And after our state historian asked me to speak at this annual meeting, PEO wouldn't leave my mind. Whenever I tried to think about a way to explain, say, Hegel's 1807 theory of history as the dialectical unfolding of spirit in time, up jumped PEO. When I thought of how to apply Fernand Braudel's 1955 account of long, enduring history of the tides of almost geological time, PEO leapt to mind. When I thought about a complaint of the loss of my childhood library, the old Carnegie Library, torn down years ago to build a jail. And I was all set to make that complaint. Instead, up popped PEO. It was like a game of whack-a-mole, and however much I whacked it down, it kept popping up. So, let me tell you what my grandmother told me. As near as I can tell, out of her 107 years, my grandmother belonged to PEO for over 80 years. And she said that down through the decades, the feeling of belonging to the organization had changed. It did many of the same worthy things it had always done. But my grandmother could no longer sense that the members felt a deep bond with the group. They were friends, certainly, but not family. The knowledge that one was a PEO woman no longer contributed to these peer women's self-identities in the ways that it once had seemed to do. The weight of emotion and idea seemed to have faded. The reality became less dense. It had become more about the living than the dead, less metaphysically connected to those 7 young Methodist women in Iowa who had founded PEO all the way back in 1869. Now, one of the things I want to mention here today, in fulfillment of Dr. Jones' instructions, is that we need to have a pretty healthy suspiciousness to do history well. Just because something is said by someone who was there doesn't make it true. And we have to ask ourselves if the person has motivations to perceive the past in mistaken ways. In this case, maybe it's just what I sometimes call old man's history, a sense that the world was so much better when I was young, the sky bluer, the girls prettier, we walked to school through miles of blizzards, and it was uphill both ways. In an 1860s poem called Growing Old, Matthew Arnold points out that we still feel things in age, the same things. We just don't feel them as intensely. To grow old, he said, is to feel but half and feebly what we feel. And perhaps my grandmother was just mistaken, taking her own fading of intense emotion and equating it with a fading of emotional density for the group. But we have plenty of other evidence that the old associations no longer have the weight they once had. There was much talk years ago about the decay of the mediating institutions between the individual and the state, from the aristocratic culture's sense of family, what Edmund Burke called the little platoon we belong to in society, to the churches that Alexis de Tocqueville called the first of Americans' political institutions. Indeed, when Tocqueville published Democracy in America in 1835, he observed, Americans of all ages, all conditions, all minds, constantly unite. Not only do they have commercial and industrial associations in which they all take part, but they also have 1,000 other kinds: religious, moral, grave, feudal, very general, very particular, immense, and very small. Americans use associations to give fetes, to found seminaries, to build land, to raise churches, to distribute books, to send missionaries to the antipodes. In this manner, they create hospitals, prisons, schools. Finally, if it is a question of bringing to light a truth or developing a sentiment with the support of great example, they associate. Everywhere that at the head of a new undertaking, you see the government in France and a great lord in England, count on it that you perceive an association in the United States. The classic text of communitarian worry about this loss of the sense of community in these institutions and organizations is Robert Putnam's book, Bowling Alone, published in 2000. Using data from bowling alleys in upstate New York, Putnam pointed out the curious fact that bowling leagues had much declined from the 1950s and 1960s, while bowling itself had remained fairly stable. People still went bowling, he pointed out. They were just bowling alone. The sense of needing to join a league, an association, an entity with social weight had been lost somewhere along the way. Think of all the declining clubs and institutions in your hometowns, from Blunt to Midland, from Hot Springs to Madison, the Odd Fellows and the Elks, the Moose Club, and even the American Legion, the Kiwanis, the Isaac Walton League. Remember the Isaac Walton? Right? The Junior League. Back in the 1930s, the Nazis made several efforts to suppress the Rotary clubs that had spread to Europe from America, fearing that there was a group feeling, an institutional weight that threatened the Third Reich. Ah, yes, those dangerous Rotarians. See, you're right, we want to laugh at the idea of the Rotary as a deep metaphysical entity. But here I want to mention another danger, honoring Dr. Jones's wishes, another danger that we need to be wary of when we do history. And that is the temptation to think that people in the past were all idiots, fools, people who stupidly failed to see what we now know. Too much of our history is taught this way today. It is a kind of terrible simplifying of the past into a pair of monoliths, we morally enlightened ones versus the undifferentiated dark ages of the past. The truth is that in every age, people were addressing the problems of birth and death and social organization with the tools they had available. The Nazis were wrong to think the Rotarians much of a threat, but they were not idiots for imagining that the Rotarians might be so. Part of their objection, of course, derived from the curious way that the concept of the party works in totalitarian regimes. Marx addresses something of this in his 1850 presentation of the concept of permanent revolution, and Mussolini famously defined the platform of the fascist party in Italy as everything in the state, nothing outside the state. The Nazis were suspicious of every institution that was not the Nazi party, from the churches to gardening clubs. And part of the purpose of the bans of Jews from public life was to soil every organization in Germany with Nazi evil by forcing them to expel their Jewish members. But the Nazis also suspected that private organizations, from the churches to the Rotarians, gave people a weight, a density that made them harder to absorb in the identity of the party and the Volk. The tide of modern history had already turned. As it turns out, they were wrong. The tide of modern history was disenchanting identities, and our later recognition of the evil of the Nazi Party would only add to our current suspicion of institutions and associations. But without some institutional weight, without any metaphysical density to our identities as belonging to associations, what becomes of us? This is the crisis of America today. We share fewer and fewer communities that lie outside the economic and political arena, our work and our politics. The Tocquevillian sense of American uniqueness is all but gone. And increasingly, in social media especially, as it devours older forms of communication, Americans associate commonly only with those with whom they agree. G.K. Chesterton once quipped, "The Bible tells us to love our neighbors and also to love our enemies, probably because they are generally the same people." But how many organizations do you, do I, do we belong to in which membership in the organization outweighs strong political or social disagreement? How many organizations and associations do you have in which that matters less than that you both belong to the organization? Would you vote for someone, say, just because that person was from your own state? Wilbur Mills at the 1972 Democratic Convention was, I believe, the last candidate who could be described as a favorite son. But that was once a very common political device in American history. How are we to believe that there is something special about us, something of weight in our identities, from being a South Dakota, or a Methodist, or a Midwesterner, an Elk, a union member, a PEO woman, or even an American, for that matter? A young person recently told me, in some exasperation that I didn't get it automatically, that the history of America is simply a tale of repression, violence, and bigotry. And to try and make any kind of fine historical distinction between, say, George Washington and George Lincoln Rockwell, or between the experience of race in abolitionist Wisconsin and slaveholding Mississippi, to make any of those sorts of distinctions is to give continence to evil. And once we understand the irredeemable foundation of contemporary society, we can see that the nation grants us no more identity than a phone book does. Nations, like phone books, he said, are just lists of people who happen to live in the same area code. There was a desperation in that young man that worries me. My grandmother was a Congregationalist, a Dakotan, born in Blunt and a local of Pierre, an American, a Midwestern, a child of the prairie, a PEO woman, on and on. She carried about her a density of association and connection that gave her existence a weight, a gravitas, a multifaceted identity. That young acquaintance of mine, estranged even from his family, has few such connections, and those he has are almost entirely politically defined. The broad shoulders of life in a democracy, what Emerson would have called the habits of a democratic mind, are alien to him. The existence of those with whom he disagrees is, for the most part, an affront and a moral outrage. The question, of course, is what we can do about this American crisis of failing community. In a large sense, on a national scale, I do not know what the answer is. I have no idea. The communitarians of the 1990s thought that all we needed to do was awaken people to the need for community, and everyone would rush out and create new communal organizations. They proved wrong, in part because rebellion against rebellion doesn't escape the problems of rebellion, and a chosen tradition is never quite the same as an inherited one. But also, as I argued in my book, An Anxious Age, they failed because strong associations form from a shared goal beyond the association, not from the vague idea that it would be nice if we had community. Still, individually, on a local scale, I think there may actually be an answer. And that answer is close to what all of you have been doing. For that smaller answer involves history, and maybe especially the history of place. A year ago in a lecture in Sioux Falls that I see some of you attended, I proposed a maxim, a way of putting our self-identities in context, extracted from my thinking about the importance of death in social organizations. And the maxim was this: the significance of life comes from the future. The richness of life comes from the past. We live unto the future because we have children to support, bills to pay, tasks to be done, but our lives are thickened, made rich and tangible by the extent to which we are connected to the past. A recent poll suggested that nearly a third of children born in the 21st century, children of the past 23 years, cannot name all four of their grandparents. Only a tenth can name a majority of their 8 grandparents, great-grandparents. We could argue, as my young friend does, that this is merely an effect of the breakdown of the marriage culture, and my young friend would certainly proclaim that the loss of the old social system of marriage is a good thing. But regardless of one's position on social issues, we seem to consistently have the same results, like a ratchet that only bites in one direction, toward a weakening of the past, and consequently, an impoverishment of life. We need to give ourselves and our children some sense of belonging that comes only with a grasp of history, a connection to the past through the stories we tell of time gone by. We are born with the dead, T.S. Eliot once wrote. See, they return and bring us with them. The moment of the rose and the moment of the yew tree are of equal duration. A people without history is not redeemed from time, because history is a pattern of timeless moments. History is not the past exactly, but the past as organized by understanding and narrative. And seeing Dr. Jones here, I suppose I should mention that there's a third danger. We can get history wrong. We should always be suspicious of useful history. Perhaps it's true, for example, that the fall of ancient Rome contains lessons for modern politics. Indeed, Americans from before the Revolution have been obsessed with claiming parallels between the American Republic and the collapse of the Roman Republic into the Roman Empire. But every time we see such parallels made, every time we encounter morphological history, we should be a little suspicious. The more one knows of history, the less immediately useful it proves in any political or social sense. The differences are always greater than the similarities. Still, that doesn't mean that history is unuseful. Its greatest use is a thickening of life and its power as the ground for the roots of community. And we gain that usefulness by having robust and accurate accounts of the past in places and about people to which we form connections. In 1773, Samuel Johnson visited Iona off the west coast of Scotland, the island where, during the early Middle Ages, the Gaelic monks managed to preserve the classical learning of the Greeks and Romans against the waves of barbarian invaders that brought down the Roman Empire. And touring the ruined chapels and monasteries, Johnson proclaimed, to abstract the mind from all local emotion would be impossible if it were endeavored, and would be foolish if it were possible. Whatever withdraws us from the power of our senses, whatever makes the past, the distant, or the future predominate over the present, advances us in the dignity of thinking beings. Far from me and my friends be such frigid philosophy as may conduct us indifferent and unmoved over any ground which has been dignified by wisdom or bravery or virtue. That man is little to be envied, whose patriotism would not gain force upon the plain of Marathon, or whose piety would not go warmer among the ruins of Iona. It's a wonderful passage, sententious in the way that only Samuel Johnson could ever get away with. But I want you to notice how much the effect he describes about place depends on an awareness of history. Place is not meaningful in itself. Story makes it so. If that story is powerful enough, even a story as distant from Johnson's own experience as the Battle of Marathon, where the Greeks defeated the Persians in 490 BC, or St. Columba's founding of the Catholic Abbey of Iona in AD 563. The kind of history I think that will help us is the history that gives life to place, particularly our places, the land where we are native to the soil. This is the kind of history the great South Dakota historian John E. Miller attempted in his 2014 book, Small Town Dreams, Stories of Midwestern Boys Who Shaped America, and I think even more in his 2001 volume, Looking for History on Highway 14. History is not collections of arrowheads, exactly, but the stories of the land upon which those arrowheads were found. History is not sets of blue glass bottles and china dolls in local museums, but the lives of those who washed those bottles and held those dolls. Archaeology and genealogy are worthy pursuits, but they do not become history until they are thickened by story in which we feel connection. We cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. As Lincoln said at Gettysburg, the brave men living and dead struggled here have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. And that's an echo of what Samuel Johnson had expressed. The idea that place is consecrated by human action, and that stories we have about place are what allow us to thicken our lives with roots grown into those places. The benefits are many. Provincialism is one of the chief supports of character, Richard Weaver declared back in an 1850 talk. To be of a place, to reflect it in your speech and action and general bearing, to offer it as a kind of warranty that you will remain true to yourself. This is what it means to have character and personality. And without these things, there is no individuality. It is often observed by students of art that all the great arts of the world have been provincial. There are reasons for saying that it is a good thing to have roots in a province or a locality and to express something of it in one's being. It is good to have a local habitation and a name. I want to consider, by way of conclusion, what it means to have thickened association a metaphysical density to our small platoons and mediating institutions. History is the answer, of course, but shared with those with whom we feel in community, in communion and place, a sense of coming from somewhere in particular can contribute greatly to that. Now that creates a puzzle, for place is meaningless by itself. Only the human, or the divine, can endow a place with meaning. And apart from the battlefields of Marathon and Gettysburg, or maybe the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem, such endowments are pretty thin on the ground. How can we, in our ordinary places, find the meaning we need to make our lives richer and add density to our associations? A possible solution is to consider the most important piece of property in a town, here, say, in Pierre, South Dakota, and that is the local cemetery. From Edward Gibbon's 18th century account of what early Christianity as a political force gained from the Roman martyrs, to Ernst Renan's classic 1882 lecture, What is a Nation?, a curious truth starts to shimmer into view. We might put it this way: the living give us crowds, the dead give us community. We create true communities only when we have shared dead. Everything else is artificial and adventitious and temporary and incomplete. Every name on every tombstone is yours. Your community, your roots, your shared dead, your richness, your endowment. And the task of history is to tell their stories in ways that help us rebuild our sense of place and thereby our sense of belonging to a world of meaning and purpose. Thank you.